Welcome to the Thomistic Institute podcast. Our mission is to promote the Catholic intellectual tradition in the university, the church, and the wider public square. The lectures on this podcast are organized by university students at Thomistic Institute chapters around the world. To learn more and to attend these events, visit us at ThomisticInstitute.org.
I want to share with you how I think the work of Thomas Aquinas can be helpful in thinking through certain questions concerning religion and theology. I want to begin with the question, who was Thomas Aquinas? And I plan on talking for maybe about 45 minutes or so, and then open up the floor for questions you may have. I have on my study sheet, which all of you should have a copy of. I plan on discussing 3 topics, and I really want to stick to that. So I may go through these rather briskly, but it's either that or just one topic. And I wanted to sort of give you an overview of how I think Aquinas can be really helpful in thinking through some contemporary questions. So who was Thomas Aquinas? He was a 13th century Catholic priest in the Dominican order. He grew up in a portion of which is now modern-day Italy, which is the Naples area. He grew up in an aristocratic family, was the youngest of, I think, a dozen children. I'm not quite sure. And his parents wanted him to become a Benedictine monk. In fact, when he was 5, 6 years old, he was placed in a Benedictine monastery in order to be educated. But after he spent some time at the University of Naples, which was largely a secular university, he was drawn to the work of Aristotle and also to a new religious order that had arisen not too many years earlier called the Dominicans, the order of preachers. And it arose at the same time as the Franciscans, another what is called a mendicant order. They were orders that begged. That's how they raised money. And unlike the usual monastic orders, which separated themselves from ordinary life, the Franciscans and the Dominicans lived among the people in the sort of rough and tumble of city life. And you can see that in the sorts of ministries that they wind up having, or charisms. Franciscans dealing with the poor, and the Dominicans involved with education and doing things like the Thomistic Institute, which you are privy to this evening. Aquinas wrote a lot. He died at the age of 49 on his way to Rome, I think it was Lyons, and died, wound up being taken to a monastery where he passed away. But during his 49 years, he wrote an enormous amount of material, including the Summa Theologica, which is about 5,000 pages, and the much smaller 800-page Summa Contra Gentiles. The Summa Theologica, I actually, for the first time in my life, read the whole thing from cover to cover between January of 2019 and September of 2021. I created a daily reading of it, and if any of you ever want to do that, you should bring with you or have with you a commentary, because there are large swaths of it. Even if you think you understand Aquinas, having commentators helps an awful lot, especially the way in which the style of his writing. He not only wrote those 2 major works, which deal with general questions of Christian doctrine, everything from the doctrine of God to the nature of human beings to ethics, to questions about the afterlife, the rights of Christians in relation to government, all these sorts of questions. He also wrote biblical commentaries and commentaries on works such as Aristotle's, several of Aristotle's works, as well as other works by Christian theologians that preceded him. So this evening, we're just going to go over a tiny sliver, a very, very tiny sliver of Aquinas's insights and discuss them in relation to a few contemporary questions. So one I think a very important aspect of Aquinas' thought is a distinction he makes in the relationship between faith and reason. He talks about the preambles of faith and the articles of faith. And this is an important distinction because for Aquinas, human reason plays an important role in the way in which we can examine and interrogate the world. So there are things that we can know about divine matters through our natural reason, but most of those things that are important to things like salvation, the afterlife, the sacraments, the nature of the church, and ultimately the nature of the triune God could only be known through special revelation, which are manifested in the Articles of Faith. Now, what are the Articles of Faith? Well, basically the Nicene Creed, line by line. So there's a section of the Summa where Aquinas goes over them, and he says that those things can only be known through special revelation. Now, this distinction is important, especially when I think people interpret Aquinas in a mistaken way. One of the mistakes that people make when reading Aquinas is that even though he does say that we can know, for example, that God exists and we can know aspects of God's nature through our natural reason, he doesn't say that we have to know through our reason before we can have faith. For Aquinas, he's very much in the Christian tradition that when, in fact, we assent to the faith, it is only moved by the grace that is imparted to us that we do not earn. And for those who are familiar with church history and the debates in the fourth and fifth century about the English monk Pelagius, Aquinas is very much an anti-Pelagian. He doesn't believe that you can acquire grace by any means other than God's gratuitous decision to impart grace to you. Now, of course, he has a different view of grace than, let's say, some of the Protestant reformers had. But grace itself ultimately moves the will, and that is how we assent to the faith. And so one of the questions that Aquinas deals with at the very beginning of the Summa Theologica, this is my sort of translation of it, do you need an argument in order to have faith in God? No. In fact, he says most people don't. Why is that? Well, he says most people are dull. And the other is that people don't have the time, right? And if, in fact, we did require people to have arguments in order to have faith, we would fall into the Pelagian heresy, because it would mean that our own effort is the thing that acquires grace. And so Aquinas makes this distinction, and I think it's an important one because it says that the intellectual life, the life of the mind, the investigation of nature, the reflection on philosophy can be illuminating in our understanding of Christian doctrine. But ultimately, the individual believer does not come to faith by simply reasoning their way to it. And so you have there this interesting and I think important distinction between nature and grace. Oh, can I have that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, excuse me. I need some little refreshment. So. Thank you. So I want to talk about not only the distinction between faith and reason. That's kind of introduction to the three issues that I want to discuss, and they are these. I think there are three areas or three questions, and here I'm going to be sort of revealing my own interests, because you may think to yourself, well, those questions aren't very interesting, but they're interesting to me. And they're the things that I think, and I hopefully it's interesting to other people as well. The first issue that I want to talk about is Aquinas on natural law and how that helps us understand moral disagreement and the intuitions we may have about morality. The second question is on Aquinas on divine action, how that helps us better understand debates in science and theology. And third, Aquinas on God's nature, how it helps us understand or better understand the same God debate. So The last one, by the way, deals with this question that arose about 7 or 8 years ago. It's been around for a while, but it manifested itself in a controversy at Wheaton College in Illinois, having to do with the question of whether Muslims and Christians worship the same God. And I think what Aquinas tells us about the divine nature can help us understand why I think the answer is yes. And then the second one has to do with another contemporary debate having to do with the relationship between science and theology. In the maybe past 20 or 25 years, there's arisen, mostly in evangelical Christian circles, a movement called the intelligent design movement. And I think Aquinas' understanding of divine action, that is how God acts in relation to nature, can help us see what I think is a mistake that is made when certain scholars defend intelligent design theory. But the first one I want to deal with is the issue of natural law. So what is the natural law? Here I'm going to quote from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. The natural law, present in the heart of each man and established by reason, is universal in its precepts, and its authority extends to all men. It expresses the dignity of the person and determines the basis for his fundamental rights and duties. Unquote. This means that morality is real, that it is natural and not a mere human artifice or construction, that all human beings can know it when we exercise our reason, and that it is the measure by which we judge how we should treat others as well as ourselves. So in order to, I think, sort of draw this out, is I want to go over very briefly something that I put together several years ago for an article I published called The 10 Bogus Rules. So imagine you lived in a government, or you lived in a nation where the government had these rules or these laws. Number one, parents may abandon their minor children without any justification and without any requirement or provide financial support. It is permissible for a city or state to pass post facto laws. It's a post facto law. You do something and they pass a law later. It says it was illegal. Our Constitution actually forbids post facto laws. In fact, some of the American founders didn't want to put that in the Constitution, not because they believed in it, but because they thought that if you wrote it down, it would give the people the impression that you could erase it. And that post facto laws are so irrational that we shouldn't even give people the idea that it would be a good idea. So it's fascinating. So they had a sort of grasp of that natural law understanding. Third, the maximum punishment for first-degree murder is an all-expense-paid vacation to Las Vegas. Any city or state may pass secret laws that the public cannot know. Anyone may be convicted of a crime based on the results of a coin toss. All citizens are forbidden from believing, propagating, or publicly defending the view that there is a moral law against which nations and individuals are measured. Your guilt or innocence in a criminal trial depends entirely on your race and not on a judge or jury's deliberation or legitimately obtained evidence. Government contracts are to be distributed based on family connections and bribes and not on the quality of the bids. Original parenthood is to be decided by a special board of experts appointed by the government and not on whether one sires or begets the child. No citizen may believe, propagate, or publicly defend the view that there is a transcendent source of being that has underived existence. So I wrote those rules down. So everyone who reads those, virtually everyone, we hope, thinks there's just something wrong about those rules. The idea that you could have a post facto law, or the idea that we're going to decide guilt or innocence based on a coin toss. What Aquinas says in the Summa Theologica, in a section called, which we call the Treatise on Law, which is it's in Summa Theologica, second part of the first part, questions 91 through, I think, 110. And what Aquinas says, that the natural law is something that is the result of inclinations that God has placed in us as a consequence of the nature that he's created. So human beings are kind of ordered towards these goods. And one of those goods is the inclination to live at peace with others. And from there, Aquinas reasons, we can come to grasp certain understandings of fairness and justice. We also have an inclination for the good of life. And for this reason, we realize that when somebody's life is unjustly taken, we grasp that it's wrong. So Aquinas talks about the natural law, but he describes it in a way not to sort of give you a definitive list like the Ten Commandments, but an understanding of what seems to be intuitively correct. Now, one of the challenges that arises when we talk about the natural law is the fact that people in our contemporary culture disagree on moral issues, right? So in the 10 bogus list, the list of 10 bogus rules, virtually all of us, we hope all of us, recognize that there's something just wrong about them, right? You sense that they're unjust. And I don't have time to do it here this evening, but each of the 10, what I do in the article I published about 2 years ago called I forget the title of my own article. Four misunderstandings about natural law.
Yeah, something like that.
And so what I do is I connect each one of the 10 bogus rules to one of the goods that Aquinas mentions in his treatise on the law. And that the reason why we have these reflexes is because that's the way human beings are in fact created. Now, how does it help us? So people disagree on moral issues, right? So no matter what issue, you could think of the sorts of issues that people disagree with, like questions about abortion, marriage, questions about whether we should prohibit hate speech. People have differing views on a variety of questions, not only within society, but cross-culturally. What Aquinas says, and I think this is really helpful, is that you have to ask deeper questions about why is it that people disagree on these questions. So let me select one of them, the issue of abortion. So on the issue of abortion, if you look at why people disagree on the question, that is the moral questions, just setting aside the legal question. But if you run into somebody who says, I think abortion is morally justified, and if they're reasonably sophisticated, they're going to give you an argument as to why they think their position is correct. And if you read some of the more sophisticated defenders of this view, they will agree with pro-lifers, people who oppose abortion, that it is wrong to kill persons without justification, or wrong to kill innocent persons without justification. But where they're going to disagree over is the question of what constitutes a person. So think about the ways in which people try to justify injustices. So I don't know if any of you have ever seen the film The Mission with Robert De Niro. It's about 30-something years old now. When I first began teaching, I used to be able to cite that film, and about half my students had seen it. Now if I say, how many of you have seen The Godfather? And virtually none of them have. By the way, the first 6 minutes of The Godfather is all you need to know about the meaning of life. I don't know if you've ever, how life really works, not the meaning of life. How life really works. What?
That's the meaning of life, that's Monty Python.
That's right, yeah. So in The Mission, there's a scene where Robert De Niro, who has undergone a kind of conversion, is observing a debate between several Portuguese leaders on about the enslavement of the indigenous people in South America. And one of the admirals, if I'm getting his rank correctly, says, no, it's wrong. These are human beings. And somebody else says, no, they're not. Of course, the second guy is totally wrong. But what it shows, though, is a recognition that if, in fact, an individual is made in the image and likeness of God, you cannot treat that individual in a way that's dehumanizing or beneath his dignity. But in order to rationalize their injustice, they had to tell themselves a story, right? And the story is these are subhuman in some way. And so what's interesting is if you ever see the way in which people argue for views, even views you consider to be disreputable, they typically will try to come up with some rationalization. Why? Because they already recognize the natural moral law. Right? So if you get into a discussion with somebody about whether something is just or not, nobody ever says, yes, it's unjust, but I defend it. What do? They say, no, it's really just, or it's really fair, right? Because they already have presupposed that as an assumption. Right? So I think one of the things that's really helpful about Aquinas' view of the natural law, and something that he discusses in the treatise on law, is he can account for the disagreement. Right? So there's a portion of the treatise on law where he explains why people, in fact, even if people recognize the natural law, why do they violate it? Well, they violate it because human beings are not purely rational. We also are organic beings. We're rational animals, meaning that we also have emotions, or what he calls passions. Right? So I have students who know that plagiarism is wrong. Why do they do it? Because they're drawn by their emotion, right? I don't have to write a paper. That's too much work, right? I'd rather go on spring break early. There's all sorts of reasons, right? In fact, I had a student once whose plagiarism was so bad that not even his sin was original. That's okay. Oh, it was funnier than that. So what Aquinas... So what I think it's the natural law, his view of natural law is helpful, not only because I think it's true, but also because it helps us better understand why people disagree. In fact, it actually helps us when we have disagreements with people to realize that we have a lot more shared moral understandings than we may think. Right? So the second issue I want to move on to, and that is Aquinas on divine action. So there's a lot here that we could go over, but this is the short version of it. Aquinas believed that God created the universe, but not in the sense that God sort of created the universe and the universe is completely autonomous and separate from him. In fact, according to Aquinas, God is creating right now because he is keeping the universe in existence. So for Aquinas, God is the first cause, but not just the first cause chronologically, but the first cause ontologically. That is to say, he is keeping the universe in being right now. And so Aquinas has this other idea that's important. Not only is God the first cause, but that God can use secondary causes to achieve his end. What's a secondary cause? All the causes that we attribute to individual things in the universe. So, for example, my speaking right now, in a sense, I'm a secondary cause, right? Because God is keeping me in existence. But God can also use secondary causes, according to Aquinas, in a way to achieve his end without compromising the integrity of that secondary cause. It's kind of mysterious. How does he do that? Now, I think a helpful way to think about it, for Christians at least, is our view of Scripture. So think about when somebody says the Bible is God's word. Christians believe that, regardless whether they're Catholic or Protestant. Yes, it is 100% God's word. But yet we say Paul wrote Romans. How can it be that Paul wrote Romans, it's 100% Paul, and it's 100% God? Now, we have to believe that God can use secondary causes and even free agents to achieve an end, even when the agents are acting freely. If he can do that with individuals, agents, why couldn't he do that with nature itself? In other words, when we talk about the role that God's divine action plays in creation, we don't need to make room for God to act. So let me then tie this into the intelligent design movement. And here I'm going to be very, very brief on what the intelligent design movement teaches. So, and there's a lot of figures in the movement. Most of their work was published in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and much of it was controversial because of a court case in the Pennsylvania district court that struck down a policy that required that students be informed. In the library, there was a book defending intelligent design contra the Darwinian theory that they were taught in the classroom. And a federal district judge said that that was unconstitutional, that it violated the Constitution's prohibition of the establishment of religion. So it sort of has died down, but it still is present. It's very dominant in a lot of evangelical churches. So it's two leading figures, Bill Dembski and Michael Behe, who are both friends of mine. I think that they're mistaken, but they're still friends of mine. And Bill and Mike both argue for something called, Bill argues for something called irreducible complexity. Michael defends something called irreducible complexity, and Bill defends something called specified complexity. What each of them argues is that if we observe nature, we notice that that natural objects and living organisms exhibit either law-like characteristics or certain events occur as a result of chance. But there are some things in nature that seem not to be the result of either chance or law. And when we observe those things and we figure out that they are such a high level of complexity, we can infer that they were designed, that they weren't the consequence of either law or chance. So to give a kind of simple example, imagine you've got a bunch of Scrabble letters and you just sort of toss them in the air and they just land in all different kind of weird ways, right? That's kind of chance-like, right? So whatever pops up with the Scrabble letters, some gobbledygook, that's just chance. But if I, let's say, let go of a Scrabble letter and hits the ground, that's law-like. Every time I let go of it, it's going to hit the ground. But supposing I toss up the letters and they spell something like, hi, my name is Nebuchadnezzar. And, at that point, you should be frightened, right? Or supposing you're eating alphabet soup, I guess a better example, and your name is Bob, and the letters spell B-O-B, your soup is not talking to you. However, if, in fact, you pick up the spoon and it spells, and supposing your name is Nebuchadnezzar, and it says, hi, Nebuchadnezzar, you should probably call a Campbell's soup exorcist. So what Behe and Dembski are trying to articulate is that there are aspects of nature, and Behe singles out the bacterial flagellum, which is a part of a cell that has motor-like functions and can't be, according to Behe, reduced to anything else. The problem that I see with that view, and this is where I think Aquinas can be really helpful, is that according to classical theism, that's the view that Aquinas holds and was the view embraced by virtually every Christian up until just recently. And that is that God not only creates the bacterial flagellum, he also creates the law and the chance. That is to say, let's say, to pick a very famous public intellectual, Richard Dawkins, who published a book back 15, maybe 18 years ago called The God Delusion. Dawkins argues against intelligent design, arguing that eventually science is going to figure out, is going to give a Darwinian story that accounts for these things. And so Behe and Dembski, their projects are only going to fail. But the problem, according to sort of a Thomistic understanding, is that basically says that in order for God to act, we need to find room in nature. And that God, that short of that, then atheism is the rational position. And that to me is a concession that no theist should make. Not only because I think it's just a bad strategy, it's also an inadequate view of the way in which God works in nature. Now, the traditional way in which someone like Aquinas would argue for the existence of God is based ultimately on the fact that the universe, as a contingent entity, needs something to keep it into being. And we don't have time to get into his arguments here. But his argument is not based on sort of trying to find gaps in nature for God to work. And it seems to me that that's a mistake that Christians shouldn't make. It's not to say that intelligent design theory isn't worth pursuing on one level, or that the scholars who defend it shouldn't be allowed to make their cases. But I think it teaches us the wrong lessons about God and nature. Lessons that I think are ultimately deleterious to a Christian worldview. One more thing about design. So so if, in fact, we should reject intelligent design, does that mean that someone like Aquinas doesn't believe that nature is designed? No, not at all. Aquinas did believe nature is designed, but he believed that things in nature, like living organisms, are intrinsically ordered. So it isn't as if organic beings are like artifacts. It's not as if human beings are like watches. Why are watches artifacts? Well, they are physical entities that we put together by taking pieces of nature, rocks and metal and so forth, and imposing on it our extrinsic design. Human beings and other living organisms are intrinsically ordered. And so for this reason, Aquinas believed in something called final causality. And interestingly enough, final causality is very difficult to deny. Even someone like Richard Dawkins has a very difficult time denying final causality. And to give you an example of this, from his book, The God Delusion, he talks about a paleontologist named Kurt Wise. Kurt Wise, I think he's now retired, but he is a brilliant guy. I've actually met him, and he's both Kurt and Wise, which is very rare that somebody. It's like meeting an orthopedic surgeon named Bone Cutter. So Kurt, in his own memoir, talks about why he never could become a professor at a Research One university. He did his PhD at Harvard under the great paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, and did his undergraduate degree at the University of Chicago in geology. Brilliant guy, but was a young Earth creationist. That is, believed that the Earth is only 10,000 years old, and that the right way to read the first couple of chapters of Genesis is literally. Now, that's a view that if you're a Catholic, you're not required to hold, and it's one that I do not hold. I think it's a mistaken view. But Richard Dawkins, in his book, The God Delusion, talks about Kurt Wise, and this is what he says. As a scientist, I am hostile to fundamentalist religion because it actively debauches the scientific enterprise. It teaches us not to change our minds and not to want to know exciting things that are available to be known. The saddest example I know is that of the American geologist Kurt Wise. The wound to his career and his life's happiness was self-inflicted, so unnecessary, so easy to escape. All he had to do was toss out the Bible or interpret it symbolically or allegorically, as the theologians do. Instead, he did the fundamentalist thing and tossed out science, evidence, and reason along with his dreams and hopes, unquote. It's interesting about that quote by Dawkins. He says that Kurt Wise hurt his career and inflicted on himself something inconsistent with his happiness. That implies that Kurt Wise is a being who in fact is ordered towards happiness. A being that is obligated to do things to promote his own flourishing. And that we are, as human beings, required or obligated to do not only what is best for us, but to know the truth. Everything I just said implies a kind of intrinsic order to human beings. Now, it's not artifactual order. It's not the sort of order of an iPhone or a watch or a clock. It's similar to it, but it's not the same kind of thing. And so what Dawkins ironically is doing is engaging in design language. It's not the design language of the intelligent design advocates. It's a different kind of design language. It's the kind of design that Aquinas had talked about. In fact, Aquinas himself says, what are human beings ordered towards? Happiness. Now, for Aquinas, we aren't fully happy until we see the beatific or have encountered the beatific vision. That is to say, in this life, we can never have full or complete happiness. We can only have happiness with union with God. But nevertheless, he does argue that we are ordered towards that happiness. And so the irony is that someone like Dawkins, who is a dyed-in-the-wool atheist and ridicules people like Wise and feels sorry for them, yet he winds up using the very language and concepts that seem to only make sense in a universe that is, in fact, teeming with order. Finally, the same God question. The same God question. So, in the Second Vatican Council, in a document called Nostra Aetate, this is what the fathers say. And here we're going to talk about the question of whether Muslims and Christians, and you can include Jews as well, worship the same God. This is what Nostra Aetate says. The church regards with esteem also the Muslims. They adore the one God living and subsisting in himself, merciful and all-powerful, the creator of heaven and earth, who has spoken to men. They have taken pains to submit wholeheartedly to even his inscrutable decrees, just as Abraham, with whom the faith of Islam takes pleasure in linking itself, submitted to God. As the sacred synod searches into the mystery of the church, it remembers the bond that spiritually ties the people of the new covenant to Abraham's stock. Thus, the Church of Christ acknowledges that according to God's saving design, the beginnings of her faith and her election are found already among the patriarchs, Moses, and the prophets. Now, it's clear, though, that Muslims and Christians disagree about a lot. And obviously, Jews and Christians disagree about a lot as well. When it comes to the doctrine of God, they primarily disagree on the Trinity, that God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But, according to Aquinas, we can know about what constitutes a divine nature by arguing or by submitting reasons to scrutiny when we examine what it means to be a creator of the universe. So, this is kind of short-circuiting or a shortcut to this. Aquinas eventually arrives at the conclusion, at the first first 15, 20 questions of the Summa Theologica, that God is a self-existent, simple, perfect creator of all that is, who has underived existence. That God is the fullness of being, that God lacks nothing. Unlike other things, like us, we're not the fullness of being. It's not our nature to exist. We are a combination of matter and form. God is simple. In other words, it is God's nature to exist. It's not our nature to exist. So, and one of the other things that Aquinas says is that there only can be one such being by nature. There only can be one God. Why? Because if there was a second, they'd have to have a distinction between them. And that would mean that you don't have the fullness of being. God is not one of a kind. He isn't like the last saber-toothed tiger, which would be one of a kind. He is the being from which all kinds derived their being. That is the nature, that is, in other words, for Aquinas, that's what constitutes a divine nature. And so when, for example, a Muslim or a Jew worships God, that's exactly who they worship. Now, Christians think that there's more that we can learn about God than just what reason can deliver. But that is something that we learn from what Aquinas calls special divine law, or what we call special revelation or scripture. So how do we know that God is triune? We don't know it through natural reason. We know it because God revealed that to us in the New Testament. So think, for example, of Paul on Mars Hill. So Acts chapter 17. Paul is, first part of Acts chapter 17, he's in Thessalonica, and he's preaching to he and Silas are preaching to a Jewish audience in a synagogue. And they're fairly well received. There's some criticism, but there's no indication that he has to convince his Jewish audience that he's talking about the same God. That's agreed. But then he goes to Athens, and he's walking around the city. He notices an altar to an unknown God. And he says to his audience, hey, I'm going to tell you about the unknown God. It is he in whom we live and have our being. He basically gives an account of what a divine nature really is. The self-existent creator of all that is. And then he moves on and he says, and I will tell you, though, what this God has revealed to us. And he talks about the death of a man, right, who eventually rose from the dead. And there he's giving the gospel, right? But the first part, he establishes the identity of the creator. If, let's say, half the audience walked away after the first part of his talk or his preaching, would they have gotten the right God? Yes. They would not have converted to Christianity, however. Right? So let me give you, conceptually what I'm trying to say here is philosophers make a distinction between sense and reference. So what's the difference between sense and reference? Let's say my parents they go for a morning constitutional and an evening constitutional. And my father looks up in the morning and he sees the star. And he says, there's the morning star. And in the evening, my mom looks up and says, oh, look, there's the evening star, the morning star and the evening star. And they think they're two different stars. Guess what? It's Venus. It's not even a star. Right? It turns out that they have different senses, but the same reference. Or supposing you get on YouTube and you see this young boxer from 1965. I think it was 65 when Cassius Clay knocked out Sonny Liston. Okay, and you go, wow, that guy's great. I wonder what happened to him. And then you watch film of a guy named Muhammad Ali. And you think, well, this other boxer is really good too. Well, what you don't realize is you think are two different people, but they're really the same one. Or Another example. Supposing let's say there's the example I use, I think I put it down on my notes, the example of Tony and Tina. So Tony and Tina are twins separated at birth. One of them is adopted by an uncle, and the other one is adopted by somebody that's not related to the family. And the uncle tells Tony, say Tony is adopted by the uncle, and the uncle says wonderful things about his father, and the adopted mother of Tina says awful things about the father. Right? They both are talking about the same. They both have the same reference, or they both have the same reference, but they have a different sense. So now, one more example. Imagine there are 3 college students, Ahmed, Benjamin, and Cecilia. Okay. Ahmed is Muslim, Benjamin is Jewish, and Cecilia is Christian. They go to college and they all become atheists. But then in their second year, they take a philosophy class from a Christian philosophy professor who convinces them that God exists. And they all come to believe that there is a self-existent creator of all that is. So they all believe in the exact same God, the philosophical definition that I gave you earlier that Aquinas defends in the first questions of Summa Theologica. But they're unsatisfied with that. They think that just a philosophical idea of God is just inadequate. So they study the 3 major world religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And it turns out Ahmed becomes a Christian, Benjamin becomes Muslim, and Cecilia becomes Jewish. Do they still worship the same God? Yes, because the only distinctions between the differences that they hold about God, namely Muslims deny that God can beget a son, Jews deny the messiahship of Jesus, and Christians believe in the Trinity. Those are things that each of the traditions holds is revealed specially in Scripture. And so even though they disagree, they don't share the same faith, but they do worship the same God. I think I'm out of time. So let me open the floor for any questions that you may have about. Yes?
So could another way of saying that, or another aspect of it, to say Christians, Muslims, and Jews agree on the nature of God, but on the person of God, or how his person is made?
Professor Beckwith, if you could repeat the question.
Oh, okay, yeah. So say that again.
So
He wants me to repeat it, but I So the disagreement isn't over the nature of God, but the persons? Is that what you were saying?
Yeah.
You know what? Yeah. So I think you could put it that way. I think you could say that that the persons represent relations within the divine nature, but those will only be known through special revelation. So I think another way to put it is that the Trinitarian concept of God sort of adds something to the initial understanding, but doesn't subtract anything. So in other words, in a sense, you know more about God, but not less. So I don't know if that's helpful, but yes.
Going back to irreducible complexity, it seems that what they're attacking more is naturalism and not necessarily evolution. I can see Behe, he's not necessarily attacking theistic evolution because that would presuppose a cause that's guiding the evolution, not necessarily being random, right? So the mousetrap example falls apart under theistic evolution, right?
Yeah. So let me repeat the question. So you're saying that the intelligent design advocates are really their project is to critique naturalism, and so now what you said about the mousetrap.
So Behe presents the idea of a mousetrap.
Yeah.
And that has multiple parts.
It's irreducibly complex. It couldn't evolve.
So
Yeah.
a mousetrap wouldn't. If a mousetrap is ordered towards catching mice, it can't do that unless it has all the parts, right?
Yeah.
But if we have the idea of a God that's guiding evolution or guiding the creation of the mousetrap towards the end of catching mice, then irreducible complexity is not attacking that idea of evolution. It's attacking the idea that the mousetrap came together randomly, right?
Yeah. So to repeat the question, Behe's mousetrap example is really is used to sort of illustrate that you couldn't get something like a mousetrap random. Yeah. I think that's what he's trying to do, but I don't know if that really. I don't think that counts against. So let me define what naturalism is. So naturalism is the view that all that exists is the natural world, and it's sometimes associated with something called physicalism or materialism, that all that exists is matter. I'm not sure, though, that it really does a good job of critiquing naturalism, because he's essentially conceding everything else to the naturalists. Saying, I'm not willing, I just think that's a mistake, because it's saying that, okay, you can't explain the bacterial flagellum, Dawkins, explain that. But Dawkins say, well, you mean everything else in nature doesn't require a designer? And I just think I don't think it's a good way to, I think there are better arguments against naturalism. I think, for example, the existence of a moral law is a good argument against naturalism. I think the fact that there are, that we seem to have an intellect that can know immaterial things, and I think that counts against naturalism. I also think the traditional proofs for God's existence do as well. So I understand I in this sense, I'm sympathetic to what these guys are doing, but I just think that they're just giving away too much real estate to their opponents. So, yes.
This is exactly on a point. You mentioned earlier about the young Earth creation theory. I was just wondering a little more in depth what your opinion of it was.
My opinion of young Earth creationism? I don't think it's right. I think it's a mistaken view. Personally, I've never really wrestled. It's never been a big deal to me as a Christian about the first chapters of Genesis and how to interpret them. And I don't know whether it had to do with my upbringing. I went through I grew up Catholic, and then when I was a teenager, 13 years old, I left the church and became an evangelical Christian. And when I entered that world, I became aware for the first time of some of these debates about how to interpret Genesis, but it just never was a burden for me. I don't know whether I was a weird little kid or not. It just wasn't, to me, and I think what really helped me was, if you're reading, and I'm not an Old Testament scholar, so I'm really out of my depth here. But when, for example, it says in Genesis that God walked with Adam, it's not saying he had legs. Right? I mean, so we have to, I think that an interpretation that is more metaphorical is one that makes the most sense. But then again, this is, I'm just a philosopher, not a theologian, or a biblical scholar. I mean, I'm really not that. But yeah, so for me, I've never really struggled with that issue. And in fact, when I was an evangelical, I kind of admitted that. I was invited to speak in Oceanside, California, Calvary Chapel, not on this issue, but just on the issue of moral relativism. And somebody in the audience asked me what I thought about the creation evolution debate, and I gave that answer, and I was told by the pastor I would never be invited back to speak because that was, not that. So it just never was a burden. I actually wouldn't have answered the question if I knew that was going to be the consequence. But that's, but I understand. I think one of the things about the history of it. I mean, this is, by the way, where European evangelicals have a much different take on this question than American ones, and it has a lot to do with our unique history of the Scopes trial in the early 20th century. That was the trial involving John Scopes, the teacher in Dayton, Tennessee, who was convicted for violating the state's anti-evolution statute and became this huge, it was really the first trial of the century because it was broadcast live on WGN radio. And William Jennings Bryan worked as the attorney for the prosecution, and Clarence Darrow, the famous defense attorney, defended John Scopes, and that had a big influence on the way at least American evangelicals thought about the creation evolution controversy. But if you look at some of the early American evangelicals when they first confronted evolution, they were very much open to theistic evolution. So B.B. Warfield, great Princeton theologian, defended theistic evolution. I'm trying to think of there's a Scottish theologian, James Orr, who contributed to the multi-volume series called The Fundamentals. That's where we get the word fundamentalist, by the way. In the early 20th century, American evangelicals who were fighting theological liberalism in mainline seminaries put together a bunch of pamphlets that became chapters in this multi-volume series called The Fundamentals. And James Orr wrote a piece defending theistic evolution. It fascinates people because, when we think of fundamentalists, we think of that, particular view of young earth creationism, but that only arises after the Scopes trial in terms of the dominant view. And it's largely to do with evangelicals appropriating Seventh-day Adventist literature on the issue. So I know you didn't ask for all that. So, all right, we only have a few minutes left. Yes, yeah.
I was just wondering if you could maybe explain a little more what you meant exactly by final causality with intrinsicness, because maybe I'm not seeing it.
Yeah, so final causality is what something is ordered towards. So to give you so the final cause of my eyes is to see. The final cause of my mind is to know. Right? So those are sort of easy examples, right? According to Aquinas, the final cause of a human being is union with God. God is his own final cause. So this is why the Summa Theologica is written as a kind of, it begins with the creation of the universe, and then eventually the universe comes back to God at the end. So let's say you go to an optometrist, get your eyes checked, and he says you have an astigmatism, and I have to prescribe certain glasses to you. And you say to that assumes what? That there's a right way to see, and that your eyes are ordered towards that end. Yes?
So another way to say final causality could be like final purpose.
Yes, yeah. And again, those are kind of easy examples, right? So typically any creature is kind of ordered towards being the best version of that creature. So we don't say, and it affects our judgment. So like if I were to lose my eyesight, by the way, I use eyesight as an example for two reasons. I have a brother who's an eye doctor, and I've had 2 detached retinas. I'm fine now, but if I almost went blind in my right eye, and imagine, I were to go blind. Blindness is a lack that I have because I am a being ordered towards sight. So you feel sorry for me. You say, oh, Beckwith lacks sight. But you don't say that about a rock. You don't walk across campus, you see a stone, you go, oh, poor stone, can't see. It's not the sort of thing that's ordered towards that, right? So the fact that your cat doesn't know geometry is not bad for the cat, right? Or let's say, my dog just won't speak French, right? Or, my dog, he's quiet, doesn't say a thing, right? We should go to the vet and see what's wrong with him. He's not talking, right? Well, they're not supposed to talk. But if you had a 5-year-old who didn't talk, well, you'd be concerned, right? Because 5-year-olds sometimes talk too much, right? But they are ordered towards talking. All right, I think we are just about out of time.
Did you have anything else that you wanted to say?
No, I thank you so much for having me, and hopefully what I had to say will kind of pique your interest in St. Thomas Aquinas and his work. In fact, speaking of that, Maylene mentioned, this is my book, Never Doubt Thomas, The Catholic Aquinas is Evangelical and Protestant. It came out 3 years ago, Baylor University Press. And much of what I spoke about this evening is in the book. And a lot of it has to do with my own journey from Catholic to Protestant and back again. So thank you so much for coming, and God bless you.
Thanks for listening to this lecture on the Thomistic Institute podcast. The generosity of people like you makes this podcast possible. If you enjoy these talks, please consider showing your support at www.thomisticinstitute.org/donate. Your donation of even $1 helps us reach more college students and many others with the powerful truths of the faith, and it ensures that we can keep publishing top-notch lectures on this podcast. Thanks a lot.